So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. Alrighty, chat, let's get started. How y'all doing today, chat? Happy Monday, everybody. Happy December. Winter holiday is rolling around pretty soon, hopefully. Hope y'all are doing well. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the OCD. We're going to talk a little bit about how to reject feedback. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoji. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational and entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional and get some personalized medical advice. Today, we're going to be doing a couple of quick announcements. So one is we have a Right in the Fields extension going on right now. So we've dropped our Right in the Fields DLC, which seems to be going great. I think people are learning a little bit about themselves, learning a little bit about what holds them back. Also learning how to communicate better in spite of feeling potentially strong emotions. And we also have a Ask a Coach event going on at 2 p.m. today. So I know we're starting stream, so unfortunately there may be a little bit of an overlap. But that is, we'll try to speed run stream today so that we can hop on over to Ask a Coach. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. One is we're going to talk a little bit about OCD, so that's obsessive compulsive disorder. It's something that we haven't talked about too much so far. I think people tend to be concerned about things like depression and anxiety and whatnot. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about feedback, and specifically sort of how to not take feedback personally and almost like how to reject feedback, which I know sounds kind of weird, right? So most of the time we're sort of thinking a little bit about, like what's the right way to deliver feedback, things like that. But we never really talk about appropriate ways to reject feedback. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I know it's kind of weird. So let's go ahead and get started. Any questions before we kick things off? What's up, Doc Masingo 123? Not much. What's up with you, dog? Water's good, dude. Okay, so questions about the sexiness? I honestly don't know. I guess let's get started if that's what the questions are about. Do you do topics on PhD students? What do you mean on PhD students? We talk a ton about burnout. Burnout is one of the things that I think we're actually very, very, very good at. Inner child work, I'm not sure. It's not, I don't know if that's specifically a paradigm that I use often, but yeah. Let's go ahead and get started. Are PhD students mentally okay is what they probably want to ask. I mean, that depends on the PhD student. Right? Yeah, we'll go over the difference between OCD and OCPD. So let's go ahead and get started then. What do y'all think? Sound good? Okay. Okay. So I want to talk to y'all today a little bit about OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. And I think that this is really important because one of the things I've noticed is that people sort of increasingly have anxiety, and people are also like somewhat perfectionistic. So a lot of times people will ask me questions about, I'm anxious all the time, or I'm very perfectionistic. Like, how do I deal with those kinds of things? And one of the things that I found as a psychiatrist is that people don't really know what obsessive compulsive disorder is. And oftentimes what we'll kind of do is mislabel it. And by mislabeling it, what we end up doing is sort of making it difficult for us to like get the appropriate treatment or help for it. So I'd love to talk to y'all a little bit today about OCD. And the other reason that this is important is because I think OCD has some of the most unusual psychotherapy involved with it. So in my experience, sort of treating people with OCD, the angle I take in psychotherapy is actually quite different from how I do psychotherapy for basically everyone else. And the reason that I think this is important is because I think that psychotherapy for OCD gives us an insight into a fundamental skill that is probably the most important thing for all people. So if I had to take one skill that I teach people in psychotherapy, and if I could teach that to every human being on the planet, what I'd actually do is draw that skill from psychotherapy for OCD. And the reason for that is because OCD is this disease, which we'll dive into in a second, which is all about obsessions. So we have particular thoughts that are kind of intrusive, unwanted, or don't sit well with us, and compulsions. So compulsions are actions that we take in response to thought. So even if you look at the neuroscience of OCD, what we sort of know about the neuroscience of OCD is it's caused by this particular part of the brain that starts with sort of where our attention goes. So it's a disorder of attention. So certain thoughts will dominate our mind. And then furthermore, those thoughts, once they start to dominate our mind, will lead to behavior. And these are what we call compulsions. And these compulsions are so severe that they'll sometimes end up hurting us. So for example, like a really classic thing that people are familiar with is excessive hand washing. So I'm so concerned about having germs, I have this thought in my head, oh my God, my hands are dirty, my hands are dirty, my hands are dirty. And even if I know it's irrational, I can't control that thought. And the only way I can get rid of that thought is to wash my hands with blistering hot water and soap 7 times in a row, to the point where my hands are peeling, they're cracked. Sometimes people will even get infections from excessive hand washing, which then launches the OCD into a whole different cycle. So if we really look at OCD, what we sort of know is that in the brain, it's kind of involved in this set of circuitry that sort of dictates the connection between thoughts and actions. And specifically what happens in OCD is people have thoughts that are so strong that they lose control of their actions. And so the most important thing about treatment for OCD is that we want to teach people how to not be controlled by their thoughts, how to sever the link between thoughts and actions. And the reason this is important for everyone is if there's one core skill that I could teach every human being on the planet, it would be how to separate your thoughts from your actions, how to act independent of the way that you're thinking or feeling, and also how to have particular thoughts and feelings which make you feel bad and not be kind of beholden to them and force yourself into action. So a really good example of this is, unhealthy coping mechanisms. So if I have particular thoughts or particular feelings, let's say I'm feeling lonely, let's say I'm feeling unlovable, in order to get rid of those thoughts and feelings, I may do something like call an ex who's always down to, hang out or whatever, even though they're really toxic for me. So what we sort of see is that a lot of what we struggle with in life, like I want to play video games today, I feel bored, I don't feel like working. So we have all of these internal impulses, and then we give in to those internal impulses. So oddly enough, I think if you had to summarize the goal of OCD treatment, it's almost to like make people disciplined. And so what that sort of means is that this is a scientifically verified technique that helps about 83% of people separate their thoughts from their actions. And keep in mind, these are thoughts that are so powerful and so overwhelming that they will lead to major problems in these people's lives. So we're going to that's part of the reason that I want to teach about OCD, and let's kind of dive into a little bit more detail. So the first question is, what is OCD? So like I mentioned earlier, OCD is characterized by thoughts or obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions are basically thoughts that have a couple of key features. The first is, generally speaking, they're intrusive, i.e. you don't want to think about them, right? So you're going about your day and you kind of like are enjoying yourself, and then suddenly certain kinds of thoughts will crop up. So good examples, like the most common forms of OCD intrusive thoughts are things related to contamination and hygiene. So sometimes people will kind of feel dirty. Other times it'll be something related to danger. So you'll have intrusive thoughts about people kind of getting hurt or having accidents or things like that. One way, and part of the reason that I think this is important to discuss is because a lot of times people will come in and will say, I'm anxious about, my kids getting hurt, or I'm always worried about bad things happening to other people. That's not really an anxiety disorder. For a lot of those people, what that really is OCD. So a preoccupation with particular people getting hurt, yourself getting hurt, bad things happening, things like that. Another really important part of OCD is that oftentimes the obsessional thoughts, the intrusive thoughts, are very like immoral in nature. So you'll have thoughts about hurting other people. Sometimes they're sexual in nature. So you sort of have these thoughts that we would kind of associate with being very immoral or being a degenerate in some way. So those are some of the really common ways in which obsessions will actually manifest. So we're concerned about danger. We're concerned about hurting other people. We're concerned about kind of, forbidden thoughts, thoughts of contamination, things like that. So the other aspect that's important to talk about actually is that the other way that people with OCD will kind of manifest is with thoughts around symmetry or organization. And this is where we have to draw a really big distinction between OCD and OCPD. So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, and OCPD is basically what we call being a control freak. So people with OCPD, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, is actually completely different from OCD. A lot of times nowadays, especially on social media, people will use statements like, "Oh my God, I'm so OCD. If anyone rearranges the shoes in my house, I get completely bent out of shape," or "I need my bathroom organized a certain way," or "I need the kitchen organized a certain way." And people who are essentially control freaks and need to have something done in a particular way, those people are OCPD. OCD, once again, is a little bit different. They may be not obsessed. They may be sort of very focused on symmetry or organization, but there's a big difference, which is that usually OCD people know, or people with OCD know, that what they're asking is irrational. They kind of recognize that these thoughts are intrusive and I don't want it. I wish I could be okay with some of this stuff. Whereas OCPD people are completely fine with their OCPD. They actually want everyone to conform to their way of thinking. Their thoughts are not intrusive. They're not trying to get rid of their thoughts. They genuinely think that this is the way that things should be and everyone should listen to me. So this is a key feature which in psychiatry we call ego-syntonic or ego-dystonic, which means, is it okay with you? Do you think that this is actually good, or do you actually want to get rid of it? In the case of OCD, this is ego-dystonic, which means that people with OCD usually don't like the thoughts. They don't like having the thoughts. They try to actually make the thoughts go away. And people who are OCPD are ego-syntonic, which means that they don't think that anything's wrong with them. They actually think that everything is wrong with other people. The shoes need to be arranged this way, and it's the fact that other people are so disorganized and barbaric that they don't want shoes arranged this way. But this is the right way to do it. And so that's a key differentiating feature. So going back to OCD, so we know that we've got kind of obsessions that have 4 particular types, right? So contamination, symmetry, thoughts of danger, and sometimes kind of like forbidden or blasphemous or kind of scandalous thoughts. The other things about these thoughts are that they tend to be, as we mentioned, intrusive, which means that you're kind of going about your day and you don't want to have those thoughts. The thoughts can also be so severe that they impair your focus. So once an obsession actually crops into your mind, like you're not able to focus on other things. And this is what really makes OCD like a bad disorder, is that along with the obsessions, there tend to be compulsions. So compulsions are behaviors that we engage in, which we may recognize are irrational. So we know, like, logically that washing my hands 7 times, washing my hands once should be enough. Like, logically, I know that if I use soap and water, like, that should be sufficient. But a key thing about all these compulsions is that they're sort of like, even though they're illogical, or sometimes they'll even be sort of magical in nature. So I'll give you all an example. So I had a patient who, anytime their family was taking some kind of long distance journey, like a car ride that was over about an hour and a half, or any kind of plane or something like that, they had to repeat some kind of like mental magical spell in their mind. And if they said a particular statement to themselves 7 times in a row, that would mean that whatever kind of dangers their family was like exposed to would be staved off. And if they didn't repeat this prayer 7 times in a row, for each person that's traveling, by the way, then something bad was going to happen. And even if you ask this person, like, hey, what do you think about that? They'd say, I know it makes no sense. Like, there's no way that the thoughts that I have in my head are going to determine whether a plane crashes or not. But I really have to do it, because if I don't, their plane will crash. So there's some amount of understanding that the compulsions don't actually like relate to what people are doing, or it's some sort of weird magical or mystical connection. So compulsions are repetitive behaviors that we use that may be a little bit illogical, but we feel sort of out of control with them, right? We have a compulsion to do them. And the key feature here is that the compulsions actually reduce our mental stress. So if we look at the purpose of compulsions, if you talk to someone who has OCD, they have particular thoughts, and then the only way they can get relief from those thoughts, the only way they can calm down the thoughts, the only way they can go back to studying, the only way they can enjoy a movie is if they go through the compulsions. So engaging in the compulsion, whether it's a physical compulsion of like, turning on and off the stove 7 times, that's a really classic thing, or arranging things in a particular way, or sometimes we forget that compulsions can be mental in nature too. So they don't even have to be outward acts. That we have to engage in the compulsion, and then what happens is once we engage in the compulsion, then the obsession kind of calms down, relaxes, or goes away. And so this is sort of in a nutshell what OCD is. And we're going to tunnel down kind of a little bit further into understanding why this is such a problem and kind of what's going on here, okay? So the first thing that I kind of want to touch on is that we sort of know that OCD comes from this part of the brain called the corticostriatal thalamic circuit. So there's a particular part of our brain, which is, it's a circuit that's involves 3 or 4 regions. And this thing forms a circuit that basically governs attention with action and reward. So what we're thinking about, what we do, and what we end up, the benefit that we get from it. And the tricky thing about OCD is that once I have these obsessional thoughts, once I have all of these negative thoughts, let's say they're like kind of forbidden sexual thoughts or something like that, I don't want them, they're intrusive, they're distracting me from studying, and I feel bad about myself for having them. So that's another thing that happens with OCD, is that people will start to make judgments about themselves for having the thought. So if I'm having like kind of forbidden sexual thoughts, I think of myself as a degenerate or a pervert. That in turn can induce things like shame and can even lead to some amount of things like suicidality. So if I'm sort of having these thoughts that I can't control, then what I sort of discover is that I feel so bad for having these thoughts. Whereas if I take a shower, if I'm having obsessive, intrusive sexual thoughts, if I shower 3 times, that'll wash away the impurity or wash away the sin. And then what happens is I'm sitting there studying and I have to go into the shower and then I have to wash 3 times, then I leave, I come back, and then I end up like studying for a little while, and then the thoughts come back, and then I have to go back and I have to shower. So if we kind of look at what's going on in the brain here, we have a particular amount of mental distress, and our brain learns that in order to relieve the mental distress, what I have to do is engage in the compulsion. And so this is why this corticostriatothalamic circuit of our brain kind of gets bent out of shape. We know that this circuit in our brain becomes hyperactive in people with OCD. And essentially what's going on here is that I have a thought, it leads to a particular action, and since the action relieves my mental stress, that behavior actually gets reinforced. So the tricky thing about OCD is that the more that we give in to our compulsions, the stronger the compulsions become. And this is actually what's so devastating about it, is we get stuck in this cycle because the only way that we know how to fix this thing is actually by giving into it. And so this is what makes psychotherapy for OCD actually a little bit different. When I look at most of my patients that I do psychotherapy for, part of what I sort of think about is I want them to understand themselves, right? We want to understand, okay, what is the origin of your feelings? How did you come to feel this way? What do you believe about yourself? There's all kinds of stuff around identity and the past and sort of like understanding like how your mind developed in this way. But with OCD, it's actually a little bit different, because in psychotherapy for OCD, we actually don't care about the content. So we don't care that you have, let's say, an obsession around cleanliness, or you have these intrusive thoughts that are harmful in nature or sexual in nature. There are some areas of psychotherapy that will do that kind of work, like so psychoanalytic perspectives will kind of focus on that kind of perspective on OCD. But generally speaking, what I found to work the best is not to dig into the content of your thoughts. So whatever the thought is, like, we don't really care in a sense, right? So whether you're worried about cleanliness, or whether you're worried about hurting other people, or whether you're afraid that other people are going to, like, their planes are going to crash. The content of your OCD, the content of your obsessions, is not actually the important thing. The important thing that we try to teach in psychotherapy for OCD is actually the ability to tolerate your negative emotions and not give in to the compulsions. And the reason that I think that's incredibly important is because that fundamental skill is actually the skill that the Buddha, yogis, and monks try to entrain in India. So for thousands of years, we've had this spiritual tradition that is trying to separate out our actions from our thoughts. And so what we try to do in psychotherapy for OCD is, as these thoughts start to arise within you, you start to feel particular things, right? So if let's say I have a forbidden sexual thought. So as this thought arises, I make certain judgments about myself. I feel bad. I have difficulty focusing. I start to think of myself as a bad person. And my brain has kind of figured out that there's one thing I can do to make these thoughts go away, which is, let's say, shower 3 times. The tricky thing is that if I shower 3 times, it works, right? So if I go into the shower, soap up everything, wash everything off, and then go through that two more times, I may start to get raw skin. My skin may start to dry out, but the thoughts get relieved. And this is the problem with OCD, is that essentially what we end up doing is harming ourselves through relieving our obsessions. The only way we know how to calm down our mental struggle or our mental anguish is by going through these behaviors. And so essentially what we want to teach is the ability to tolerate that negative emotion and not give in to the behavior. And the reason that I think this is important, even if you don't have OCD, is because this is a fundamental skill that everyone needs to learn, right? If we really think about it, what causes us problems in life? It's essentially a lot of mental anguish, right? So if I don't want to go to a party because I feel embarrassed, if I don't want to go to a party because there's someone there that I asked out a week ago and it's going to feel awkward. So what do I end up doing? I end up not going to the party. I end up using an avoidance strategy to avoid triggering that negative emotion. And so then, and people with OCD do the same thing. One of the key hallmarks of the actual diagnosis is the development of avoidance behaviors, right? So if certain things will trigger obsessional thoughts, and then I have to go shower 3 times, then I can't watch any TV or anything like that that could trigger even a remotely sexual thought. And so then what happens with people with OCD is they start to build walls around their life, and they're not able to actually like live a full life because they're so terrified of triggering the OCD that they start to avoid particular aspects. And we see that in normal people as well, that when I start to avoid negative thoughts, when I start to avoid particular situations, when I start to avoid putting myself in an uncomfortable state, I start to close off the doors of opportunity in my life. So at the end of the day, OCD, I think, is something that's horribly, horribly misunderstood. You know, at the top of the list, the most important thing that's kind of like relevant to OCD is that it's not OCPD. So one of the biggest misnomers is that being a control freak is not really what OCD is. OCD is characterized by having intrusive, persistent thoughts that are ego dystonic, i.e., I don't want to have the thoughts. I don't think they're good thoughts. I don't think they're logical thoughts. I wish they would just go away. And the second consequence of OCD, or the second piece of it, is some kind of compulsion, that our brain figures out that we can either go through a mental process or a physical process, some kind of action, even if the action is mental, like repeating something to myself over and over and over again in my head. I can engage in some kind of action that will relieve the obsession. The reason that I think this is really important is because if you actually ask someone who has OCD, what do you feel? They'll describe anxiety. So they'll describe, oh, I feel really worried, I'm terrified. They'll describe a lot of anxiety and fear. So a lot of times what they think is that they've got an anxiety disorder or their anxiety is really bad. Truly what it is OCD. The other problem with OCD is that as human beings tend to do, we develop our own intuitive adaptations to the OCD. And the problem with those adaptations is that those adaptations actually cause oftentimes more damage than the OCD itself. If I'm kind of like triggered by particular things in my surroundings, that triggers kind of the obsessional thoughts, and then the only way I can get rid of them is the compulsions, the best strategy for me is to avoid big parts of life in general, because then I don't have to, if the thoughts don't get triggered, then I don't have to worry about the compulsions, and it's the only way that I can feel safe. The other big problem with OCD is that oftentimes this whole cycle leads to a lot of shame. So this is where people with OCD will come into my office and they'll describe to me, oh, I'm depressed, I'm suicidal. But the more that I do a diagnostic evaluation in them, the more I discover, oh, this is not a mood disorder. This is actually a consequence of untreated OCD, which is intense shame for these intrusive thoughts that we never asked for. But since I'm having these thoughts all the time, it must make me a bad person, right? I must be a degenerate. And the only thing that I can think of is to take my own life to provide relief and protect the world from how awful I am. So OCD oftentimes masquerades as lots of other things. The last thing to consider is that in terms of psychotherapy for OCD, I think it's really important because the skills that we teach in psychotherapy for OCD, I think, are the most generalizable to the rest of the population. And what we really kind of target or focus on is this idea that if you feel mentally unwell within your being, that there are always actions in the outside world that you can take. And those actions that you take in the outside world can actually relieve the mental distress within, right? So if I'm feeling mentally unwell, or if I'm bothered by the asymmetry of my workplace, I can spend 15 minutes organizing everything. And that makes me feel better. The problem is that every time I do that, what I'm essentially training my mind to do is to solve internal discomfort with external actions, right? I'm training my mind that the only way to get rid of this internal feeling is to act in a particular way. And we see this a lot in our community. Let's say, like, I'm procrastinating, right? I feel bad about myself. I feel bad that I'm not studying and I should be studying and I want an A. And the only way I can manage these emotions is to engage in some kind of unhealthy behavior. So I'm going to spend the day gaming. I'm going to procrastinate and binge watch some anime. I'm going to do something. I'm going to spend some time on Twitter or social media. I'm going to do anything but the work that I need to do. And so if you look at like this fundamental idea of, okay, if you do this, what is your brain? What is your corticostriatothalamic portion of your brain? What does that circuit learn about the solution to feeling bad on the inside? What it learns is that, oh, the next time we feel bad, we should actually just start playing a video game, because that's what fixes our problems, right? That's what leads to a relief. If you think about it, there's a reward circuitry involved here. I'm feeling bad, and if I engage in a behavior, that behavior gets reinforced because the reward is really good. I don't feel bad about myself if I start playing a video game. And so what we actually end up doing is reinforcing the negative behavior. And that circuit seems to be what's hyperactive in OCD. So this has been a kind of a really quick overview of OCD. There's a lot more that we could talk about in terms of the details of like what psychotherapy for OCD is like. The neuroscience of OCD is really fascinating. Even psychoanalytic perspectives on OCD are really fascinating. But this is kind of a quick overview that I really wanted to share with y'all to really help you understand a little bit about what OCD is, why it's so devastating, and a little bit about even how treatment for OCD can be useful for every human being on the planet. Questions? I saw that there was someone gifted a ton of subs, so thank you very much, whoever you were. Something about am I wisdom or something? Okay, so a lot of good questions. Okay, so first question is, what happens if you ignore the compulsions of OCD? So this is a really great question. So if you ignore the compulsions for OCD, it gets better. So ignoring compulsions for OCD is very successful, provided you can ignore it 100%. So let me give you all an example. So if I have an obsession and I feel bad and I have a desire to have a compulsion, as the desire to have the compulsion rises, if I'm able to resist, then it works out great. If I'm completely able to resist, then that's fantastic. What's actually counterintuitive is that if I wait until the desire for compulsions gets really, 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 really bad, and then I cave, it actually reinforces the opposite of what we want, okay? So I'll give you all a simple analogy. So let's say I have a 2-year-old who wants to watch the iPad while they're having dinner, right? So 2-year-old says, can I have the iPad? Or 2.5-year-old, let's say 3-year-old. Can I have the iPad? Parent says, no, you can't have the iPad. 3-year-old gets a little bit upset, right? Can I have the iPad? No, I wanted the iPad. Parent says, no iPad. And then 3-year-old starts throwing a temper tantrum. Throws food, goes, nah, I want an iPad. And then the parents are sitting there at a restaurant, and what do? They give them the iPad to calm them down because this is ridiculous. We're at this nice restaurant. The kid has taken this bowl of pasta and thrown it on the ground. So now ask yourself the question, what behavior are you actually reinforcing in the child? What is the child learning? The child is learning that in order to get access to the iPad, I have to throw a temper tantrum. So even though parents are providing the iPad to make the temper tantrum go away, what they're actually doing is reinforcing temper tantrums. Because now the kid realizes, oh, just whining a little bit doesn't work. Raising my voice doesn't work. If I want the iPad, what do I have to do? I have to throw a full-blown temper tantrum. And it's the same way with things like compulsions and OCD. So if you can tolerate it, you want to tolerate it as best as you can. And ideally, you want to tolerate it 100%, right? So that's why part of the psychotherapy is in sort of picking particular situations where you can win. So it's not trying to tolerate the strongest of compulsions, but let's start by picking the battles that we can win instead of the battles that are going to wipe us out. And once we win one small battle, we level up a little bit, and then we can handle a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one, right? So going back to our child's analogy, let's think about, okay, so what would I advise to a parent in that situation? I'd say, even if they throw a temper tantrum, let them throw the temper tantrum at home, but don't give them the iPad. If you go to the restaurant, then if they ask for the iPad, give it to them right away, right? So you can sort of create these different scenarios, one where they're learning to resist, and then over time, we can work our way up to resisting in the more difficult situation. So we want to resist our compulsions. That's the end goal. But the tricky thing we have to watch out about, and this actually also happens in people with addictions, which is that if we resist the cravings, for example, in addiction, but the cravings get really bad and then we give in, right? I'm going to resist for 1 day. I'm going to resist for 2 days. I'm going to resist for 3 days. And I give in on the 4th day. What does our brain learn about how to get the substance? What it learns is, oh, the more intense I make these cravings, then this dumbass will listen to me. Let's say I want alcohol or nicotine or whatever. And like, if really bad cravings is what we need to get it, then why don't I just start with really bad cravings? And so this is something paradoxical you see in addictions as well, which is that the more people kind of try to resist and end up failing, the more intense their cravings actually can become. So it's really tricky, but basically you want to start small. You want to resist until you're 100% sure that you want to pick something that you're almost 100% sure that you can win. And then over time, you want to ramp that up. Great question. So is the goal of treating OCD? So what's the goal of treating OCD? So the first thing that we want to do with treating OCD is we want to stop using compulsions as the antidote to obsessions. So as long as the compulsion is the antidote to the obsession, we're going to keep seeing the cycle. So what we need is to stop using the compulsions and also learn how to tolerate that obsession. So let's go back to this example of, okay, I have to say a particular magical spell in my mind 7 times to prevent a plane from crashing if my family members are on it. So if you think about what's the purpose of treatment for OCD in that scenario, it's what happens if you don't say the spell? Well, they could crash, and let's just kind of tolerate that, right? And so it's very, very difficult to tolerate. But once you're able to tolerate that, once you do it once, then now suddenly your mind has discovered an alternate way to deal with that negative emotion, which is that actually you don't have to deal with it at all. You just need to tolerate it for some amount of time. They land, they're safe, and then it feels kind of really bad, but that's kind of what we want to do, separate out action from sort of our internal feelings. How does addiction differ from OCD? What a great question. So the simple answer is that there are some things that overlap. specifically with the reinforcement of behavior. But addictions tend to involve a lot of other circuitry. So we know that the corticostriatothalamic circuit is the central circuit for OCD. We know that hyperactivity of that circuit causes OCD. And this is the circuit that governs our attention. So like kind of like we lose control of our attention when the intrusive thoughts pop into our head. We can't not think about the intrusive thoughts. The second thing that happens in that circuit is that it drives our behavior. And the third thing that happens in that circuit is it creates a reward system and develops habits. So what OCD basically is habitual intrusive thinking, with the only solution being a compulsion that like helps us feel better but damages us in the long run. So addictions have all kinds of other things involved. Like, so for example, addictions can have a lot of like emotional lack of awareness. Addictions have elements of impulsivity. So frontal lobe challenges and things like that. There are a lot of other circuits that can be involved in addiction. But I would say that the corticostriatothalamic circuit of the brain is involved in addictions as well. But there's just a lot of other stuff that goes into addictions. So this is a great question. How does one develop OCD? So this is fascinating. So there is good evidence that OCD has a genetic component, but there's some really interesting data. So the first is that the average age of onset of OCD is about 19. There are very, very, very few, almost 0% of people develop OCD after the age of 34. So if you're like later on in life and like at the age of 40, if something new is happening, chances are it's not OCD. Average age of onset is 19. Men tend to start with OCD younger than women, and about 25% of people have OCD by the age of about 14. And sometimes boys especially can develop OCD even like under the age of 10. So we tend to see it a little bit early. So what I tend to look for, especially when I'm talking to parents, is if you have a 9-year-old who's anxious, there's a decent chance it's OCD and not anxiety, because anxiety disorders tend to develop a little bit later. But if you look at that kid will appear to be an anxious kid, right? Because they're worried all the time. They're afraid that mom's not going to come home from work. They're afraid that every day when mom and dad get in the car, there's going to be a terrible accident. So if you talk to the kid, it looks like anxiety. It smells like anxiety. They're worried all the time. They're kind of inconsolable. And then what the parents will sometimes do is they'll figure out behaviors, right? Oh, okay, hon, I'm going to call my 9-year-old when I'm driving home from work, and I'm going to stay on the phone because that relieves their anxiety. That's actually the compulsion, okay? So that's one thing that we know. The other really interesting thing is that the genetic component of OCD tends to manifest a little bit earlier. So later in life, OCD may not be quite as genetically oriented. And people may wonder, okay, what does that mean? Like may not be as genetically oriented. So remember that OCD is this corticostriatal thalamic pathway, which sometimes can kind of get hyperactivated. So all it takes is, let's say not all, but I'm going to make people paranoid. So if I have a really, really bad situation where I have something that triggers intrusive thoughts, and once those intrusive thoughts get triggered, if I'm not careful, the way that I relieve those thoughts through a particular behavior could start the reinforcement cycle. And when I see OCD develop in people who are 25, 27, 28, that seems to be what's going on. Is there something that starts this cycle of, oh, I don't want to have this thought. I start having this thought. I can't make the thought go away. It makes me feel terrible. And I figure out something weird or unorthodox that makes the thought go away. I figure out that, oh, if I actually call my parents 5 times before, they fly down, then I'll feel better about myself. And now I start becoming a little bit obsessive around it, right? And a little bit compulsive around it. And now I need them to call me all the time, every time they're traveling. Okay. Oh, I think we already answered. So I'm a Wisdom is asking, can you connect OCD or OCD to understanding Alzheimer's? I'd say the two are completely different. So Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease that generally is like related to aging. So, and this is where there was recently a big scandal in the medical community because the original researchers that developed or discovered what causes Alzheimer's essentially falsified data. So what they thought was that there are these protein aggregates in the brain that cause cells to die. So like there's this aggregated protein that clunks up our neurons, and then the neuron can't function because it's filled with this trash. But essentially what they actually did is they photoshopped images to make the protein deposition look worse than it actually is. And the real tragedy there is that once they discovered the cause of Alzheimer's, the next 10 to 20 years of research in terms of cure and prevention were geared towards actually like stopping this process. So everyone thought, oh, we figured out what causes Alzheimer's. And then everyone else, like all the pharma companies and drug development and research funding from the government was like, okay, let's prevent Alzheimer's by stopping this process. It turns out that that process was actually false. And like, so we've just wasted 10 to 20 years of like Alzheimer's research because we've been targeting the wrong thing, because the people lied about what caused it. And the reason they lied about what caused it is because they wanted to be famous for discovering the cause of Alzheimer's, right? So I think the processes tend to be quite different. I am a little bit curious whether there's any kind of correlation over time, but generally speaking, I don't think about those things as related. Although, I mean, I could be wrong. I haven't looked at the particular, what the risk of OCD or OCPD for Alzheimer's is. Good question, though. So my issues with obsessions goes in waves for me, comes and goes. Is that normal? It can be. So generally speaking, OCD is somewhat of a, I hate to say this, but kind of a lifelong diagnosis. Like for a lot of people, it kind of doesn't get, it doesn't resolve on its own. It's not like an episode of depression, which will be self-limited by nature. But we also do know that, a lot of people will essentially like be free of OCD for their entire life. So treatment, for example, is like 83% effective at reducing symptoms by about 50 to 70%. So you can get significantly better and no longer have impairment. I've definitely worked with tons of people with OCD that essentially it doesn't cause any problems in their life. They just sort of still have the intrusive thoughts. They learn how to manage them. And then even over time, once you stop reinforcing that cycle, it kind of goes away. That's been my experience. It is normal for things to wax and wane. And there are also some really interesting hypotheses about the degree of inflammation or other kinds of temporary things that could be worsening your OCD. So poor sleep, inflammation, or other kinds of stress can sometimes worsen OCD. Is it possible to have OCD and ADHD together? Absolutely. And boy, is it a crippling combination. So remember that one of the hallmarks of overcoming OCD can be strong frontal lobes. So we don't want to give in to those thoughts. We don't want to give in to the behaviors. So one of the worst combos that I've ever seen, it's like really just a very poor synergistic combo, is when you have compulsions and you have the impulsivity from ADHD, that really causes problems. Because now you can't even resist the compulsion because you're so damn impulsive. You can't even control your mind because your mind, like you can't restrain your thoughts anyway. And so when you have a highly distractible mind, it's kind of like a leaky border wall where like OCD thoughts, it's easier for OCD thoughts to penetrate into your mind when you've got ADHD. So honestly, I've had some patients that have really struggled with this kind of stuff. Good questions. Can it get cured instead of just managed? Great question, Drop Me Stuff. I would actually go ahead and say I have seen cases where I would basically call it a cure. So the right scientific answer is we don't know, or it probably needs lifelong management. But the real practical clinical conclusion that I've come to, and I'm sure that some of my psychoanalytic supervisors would agree with this, that you can actually like essentially have OCD in sustained remission and or cure. I believe it can be. Now, does that mean that any person with OCD can achieve that? Not necessarily. So there are other things that we haven't really talked about in terms of OCD. Like there's all these nuances, like the degree of insight that you have into your illness. So there are other like variables that will determine what your outcome is. And for people who have very, very severe OCD, I don't know that they can attain a cure. But I do know that regardless of whether you have mild OCD, severe OCD, or even no OCD, you can absolutely strengthen your control over the striatal thalamic circuit, which is this circuit of your brain that has thoughts, actions, reward, and habit building. So that circuit can be addressed whether you have OCD or not. And in the case of OCD, it generally leads to significant improvement. Okay. I've been told that you just ignore kids when they have temper tantrums and act like you don't care at all. Is that real? I think it's an oversimplification to ignore kids when they have temper tantrums. So the first thing to recognize is that what is a temper tantrum? Let's just talk about this for a second, okay? This is going to be a little bit different because it's, I guess, related to parenting. So what is a temper tantrum? A temper tantrum is communication. It's a form of communication. That's literally what a temper tantrum is, right? So the kid gets really, really upset and then they act in a particular way. And what's the purpose of acting in that way? The purpose of acting in that way is to communicate something to someone else. So what a lot of people will do is they'll say, ignore temper tantrums. If we ignore temper tantrums, we have to be a little bit careful because there's some element to that that is good, which is we don't want to reinforce the temper tantrum by giving in to the demands of the person who is throwing the temper tantrum. If we give in to their demands, we will actually reinforce the temper tantrum because the person will discover, oh, if I want to get what I want, I need to throw a temper tantrum in order to get it. The flip side, though, is you don't want to give in to the demands, but I wouldn't say you should ignore it because that's going to cause different problems. So if I'm trying to communicate something to you, and you ignore my communication, what do you think is going to happen? My desire to communicate that thing I need to communicate it to you in some way. So oftentimes what we'll see is that if people completely ignore kids with temper tantrums, that'll have other kinds of psychological problems. So they'll start acting out in other ways, or they'll maybe become passive aggressive, or they'll try some other kind of communication style. So what I'd advocate is not to ignore temper tantrums. You don't have to give in to them in terms of the behavior, but I absolutely don't think you should ignore them. You should sit down and talk to them and show them that there is an alternative to getting what they want that is not a temper tantrum, right? So if someone says, oh, I want the iPad, and you don't just ignore them completely, they can throw the temper tantrum, you don't give them the iPad, but then you sit them down and you talk to them, hey, tell me a little bit about what you were feeling, what you wanted, why did you want the iPad, what's the advantage of the iPad, what's the disadvantage of the iPad, have a conversation with them. Well, I'm really bored. Okay, so like what can we do about that? Is there some other way we can alleviate your boredom without the iPad when we're going out to dinner? Would you like to try playing a game? Maybe we can play Guess My Animal, or we can play Hangman, or we can do all manner of other things. Why don't you tell me a story, or do you want me to tell you a story? And so the key thing is that you don't want to ignore it, but you want to show them, you want to engage in communication without giving in to the demands. And hopefully, and the cool thing is that once you do that and they become a part of the conversation, the other thing that you're actually reinforcing is, by the way, if you want something from me, the way to get it is to have a conversation with me where you explain what your thoughts, your needs, your feelings are, because that's what'll actually get you the iPad. And very practically, what I do with my own kids is, okay, let's think a little bit. Okay, you guys want the iPad? Let's try playing a game. And how about this? In 15 minutes, if the game isn't fun, then you can have the iPad. And oftentimes what we do is we pick a game that they all enjoy. And then even when the 15-minute mark comes around, my kids have no clue. They're completely enjoying the game, right? They've lost track of time. And sometimes I will even remind them, I'll say, hey, it's 15 minutes. Do you guys want the iPad now, or are we having fun? And if they say, oh, no, we want the iPad, then I'm going to give it to them, right? You got to show them also that there's a consistency of communication. And if you give them a choice, you don't want to trick them out of it later. That causes problems down the road. So we don't want to ignore temper tantrums. We don't want to give in to them, but ideally what we want to do is try to understand what is the communication underneath the temper tantrum. So someone's asking, I'm Wisdom is asking, Can you help me? For the last week, I've had all the symptoms of Alzheimer's and am presently in a bad place. I can talk if that is okay. I believe your insight to OCD is relevant to my problem. I'm really happy to hear that the insight into OCD is helpful to you. But if you're concerned that you have Alzheimer's, the right thing to do is actually like go get a medical evaluation, right? So that's where the reason we kind of say this isn't a substitute for medical advice is hopefully this kind of makes sense, that a big part of what medical advice entails is a detailed personal analysis of what your situation is. And the key thing there is that a differential diagnosis needs to be done as well. So could you have Alzheimer's? Who knows? But there could be all kinds of other things that cause symptoms of Alzheimer's, like forgetfulness, inattentiveness, things like that. There are all kinds of things that can cause that kind of stuff, including things like vitamin deficiencies or like, different kinds of occult infections. So that's where you really need to see a medical professional for personalized advice. Okay. Oh, thanks for the gifted subs. Okay. So we've got other stuff that we need to get to, and I want to try to finish before we do Ask a Coach, okay? Sorry if off topic, but okay, so here's another one. Okay. We'll do this last question and then we'll move on. So, if you feel guilty about messaging your therapist outside of sessions and bothering them, what should you do? So the first thing is that I would talk to your therapist about that. So generally speaking, most therapists should set boundaries around what their communication style is like. So generally speaking, what I sort of have for my the patients that I see is that our time to do the work that we're doing is during our sessions. Now, some of my patients will find that messaging me in between is useful for them. I say if it's useful for you, that's totally fine. I may not have time to respond, and I think that we should kind of focus on packaging our problems and dealing with them during our sessions. And part of the reason that I actually recommend that is because that actually teaches the patients themselves how to have boundaries around their own thought processes. So some of my patients will message me things, but it'll almost be like notes that they send me for their own understanding that we can kind of review during session. So if you're feeling guilty, I think it's like, I don't know how to say this, but that's something you should talk to your therapist about, because what's the right way to handle that? They may say, oh yeah, you can absolutely message. I may not respond to you. If you send me a page-long or 2-page email, I won't respond to you with a 2-page email, but if I have time to read it, I'll read it, and we can definitely talk about it during our session. So I think anytime you're feeling guilty about talking to your therapist about something, the right thing to do is actually talk to your therapist about feeling guilty. And then hopefully y'all will be able to develop like a good plan of like what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what lies within the boundaries of a good therapy relationship and what doesn't, and kind of like how to address that sort of stuff. Because there's enough work to do in therapy without you feeling guilty about burdening your therapist, right? There's plenty of other stuff that you need to do anyway. Okay. Should we talk a little bit about feedback? What do y'all think? We can do a meditation for obsessions. Absolutely. Okay. Give me a second. Okay. Okay. Blinding Lights again. Yeah, it's a great song. It's a banger, chat. I only whistled like 3 notes too. Okay. Hold on. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how to not take feedback personally, or even, I know it sounds kind of weird, how to reject feedback. So this is kind of important because sometimes, like when we get feedback, the first thing is we take it personally, right? So we think that there are circumstances that are outside of our control, which result in someone giving us a piece of feedback. And then we sort of take that feedback to heart. It hurts us a lot, right? It makes us feel bad about ourselves. Like a good example is if you get broken up with or someone's breaking up with you and they say, it's not you, it's me. We sort of still kind of take that feedback personally. So on the one hand, we kind of say, oh, don't take it personally, it has nothing to do with you. So what we mean by that is that if there is feedback that does not have to relate to you specifically, sometimes what we do is we make it relate directly to us. But what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different. What I want y'all to do is to not take feedback personally. And what I mean by that is almost reject feedback that is personal. So I'll give y'all an example of this because this happens way too much in spaces like work, right? So sometimes people will get feedback like, oh, you're not a team player, or you're not a go-getter. And if you really stop and think about it, what does that feedback mean, right? So if someone is not a team player, like how do you fix that? Sometimes some of the worst and most common feedback that we get at work is very personal. They say this is an attribute of who you are. They say you are not a team player. But it's not like I can wake up tomorrow and be a team player, right? You can't correct feedback by being something else. Someone gives you feedback that you're stupid. And the best place for unconstructive personal feedback is in online gaming, by the way, right? You suck at life. Uninstall, noob. That's not feedback that you can do anything about. And the tricky thing is it's not just in gaming, right? We get this feedback at work all the time, where a boss who is not very thoughtful about what you're doing wrong gives you general person-based feedback. You're not a team player. Well, what do I do about that? Because generally speaking, if you give someone personal feedback, like person-based feedback, they can't change that. I can't change who I am. So what I'd love to do today is share a little bit about, first of all, a little bit about in general, how to deal with feedback. And secondly, how to almost reject personal feedback, okay? So don't take personal feedback. So let's talk a little bit about feedback. What is the ideal kind of feedback? So the purpose of feedback is to get people to improve, right? It's to give them like opportunities generally to improve. And so that's one of the biggest problems that people, we kind of think about feedback as, okay, this is what they're doing wrong, but like, what's the purpose of telling someone something that they're doing wrong? What does that accomplish? It doesn't accomplish anything unless you can also tell them how to fix it. So the reason that we give negative feedback is to actually help people improve. Otherwise, it does no good. A simple example of this is that, so if you look at like a test, right? This is one of the biggest problems with the school system. If you look at a test, let's say I get a C on a test. And then what happens after I get a C on the test? I never get any opportunity to improve on that, right? I get the test and then we move on to the next module. So actually, if we think about how we do tests, our systems are not designed to actually have us improve our learning. They're designed to rank us, separate us, but the goal isn't actually learning. The goal of our current educational system is differentiation. And that's something that has carried forward into the workplace. And we end up getting feedback that isn't actionable, so we can't actually improve. And then what's the point of giving the feedback anyway, right? So what's the point of telling someone, hey, I'm sorry that, your situation is that, I'm sorry you're upset about your work situation. You happen to be an Egyptian slave that was born 2,500 years ago, and you need to be XYZ, right? There's no point in giving people feedback unless they can actually improve on it or act on it. So what we want feedback to be, let's run through what good feedback looks like. So first of all, it should be constructive or actionable. So it's not an attribute of yourself or personhood. It's like an action that you can take. The second thing that is ideal around feedback is that feedback should be sort of measurable or trackable in some way. So if I tell you that, I want you to be better at XYZ, I should also let someone know, how are we going to measure that? When are we going to measure that? How are we going to track progress? What does progress look like? This is where, once again, if you tell someone you're not enough of a team player, well, what do I do tomorrow morning? How do I be more of a team player? There aren't particular actions I can take. How are we measuring it? And so what we'll see in workspaces is people will be like, oh, you're not enough of a team player. You need to work on that. And so then the question is, okay, like, how do I work on that? How do you know that I'm working on it? How do I know that I'm working on it the right way? None of these questions actually get answered because we deliver this general, vague feedback, okay? So we want feedback to be constructive, actionable, and measurable. The other really important thing about feedback is, as best as possible, we want to remove our emotions and ego from the equation. So if I get feedback that I'm not doing very well in sales, or that some of my clients are complaining about, for example, my attention to detail or my tardiness in responding. So if we look at what happens during feedback, when I get that kind of feedback, I feel bad about myself, right? I feel kind of bad. It can almost be like a confirmation of the fears that I hold about myself. So if I have imposter syndrome, for example, and I get some kind of negative feedback, what actually happens in my mind is I start to panic, right? Because I'm like, oh my God, I knew I felt like an imposter. I knew I was an imposter. And now what do I do? Because like everything that I feared actually turned out to be true. All my worst fears are correct. I am an imposter. I don't belong here. And so what does that do in our mind? It sends our mind into a tailspin. We start to take it personally, right? And what do I mean by take it personally? We start to form conclusions about ourselves based on the external feedback we receive. That becomes part of who I am. And once it becomes part of who I am, it becomes unchangeable because now it's part of my personality. Now it's part of my character sheet, right? It's not like a class skill, it's a stat and it's fixed. So this is what tends to happen when we get feedback. So let's run through actually how to appropriately receive feedback and to a certain degree, almost even how to push back against it, okay? So we're going to take a quick look at this. So let's look at the general feedback situation. So sometimes what we're going to do is we're going to see, let's say we receive feedback, okay? And if the feedback is poor, it's going to be personal in nature, i.e. not a team player. And furthermore, even if it's not personal, we can sort of make it personal. So even if it's constructive, this will trigger our emotions. So emotions also trigger our ahamkar, or ego. And what does that mean? So remember that our ego is the part of our mind that protects us from negative emotion. So what it does is it starts to become egotistical. We start to compare ourselves to other people. It's essentially a protective mechanism. But once again, remember that once the ego activates, it becomes part of our identity. And the problem is that once it becomes a part of our identity, this becomes unfixable because it's who I am. Okay? Right? Because who you are is not something you can change very easily. It's not an action you can take. So if we get this kind of feedback, what I'd love to do is actually give you all sort of an idea of like how to approach feedback that will give you some help in avoiding this whole cycle, okay? Because once this also becomes who I am, what that's going to do is even if we get constructive feedback, we're going to ignore the constructive feedback and we're going to go straight to emotions. So for example, if I lack confidence in myself at work and my boss tells me that I did a bad job for reasons A, B, and C, instead of recognizing that those are things that I can fix and then do a good job, what I actually end up learning, or the takeaway that I have is, oh, I'm so terrible at this job. I'm never going to be good. There's so many other people who are better than me. And then what I end up is I end up setting up a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure because I'm not even able to incorporate good feedback because my identity or my ego takes control of my mind. Okay? So what should you do if you get bad feedback? Okay? So the first thing you should do is anticipate your emotions. So if you have a performance review coming up and you're afraid to talk to your boss, you're terrified to go in and get your feedback, right? Oh my God, what if they tell me I do a bad job? First of all, if you're terrified, that should tell you something about how you view feedback. So anticipate what your emotions are. Okay? So ask yourself, okay, what do I think I'm going to feel? How will I feel? I'll feel anxious. Why do I think I'm going to feel anxious? Okay. And then what we want to do is when you go into the feedback, you want to listen. So let's say you get the feedback. And let's say that you get personal feedback. So they say, you're not a team player. So this is where I would encourage you to push back a little bit. And then instead, so you don't have to push back in kind of a mean way, but what you can sort of do is you can ask your employer, you can say, okay, help me understand what that means. So ask an open-ended question. Then what you can do is ask, what can I do to be more of a team player? Or you can ask something like, what do team players do that non-team players don't do? Right? So what you want to do is take whatever the defining term is and translate it into actual actions. Okay? And then what we want to do is you can kind of say, okay, so I want to work on that. So you want to sort of signal to your boss that you're interested in changing. And then what you also want to do is sort of start the measurement conversation. And what is the measurement conversation? That's sort of asking, okay, so what are some examples? Like how do I know, let's say a week from now, whether I'm making progress? Right? So what does progress look like? Does that mean attending meetings? Does that mean asking other people if they need help or offering to help people? What does that look like? Okay? And you can even ask your boss explicitly, how will we know? Or how do we measure progress? Just ask them. So instead of getting, oh, you're not a team player, you need to be more of a team player, you can ask, okay, so like what does a team player do that a non-team player doesn't do? What do we, you could just ask questions like that. And how are we going to measure what actual progress looks like? Okay? Now, so this is kind of what to do, but what we're also going to talk about in terms of feedback is what not to do or how to avoid doing the harmful things in feedback. So we're going to give you all kind of a couple of like cognitive exercises that you can go through to avoid kind of falling into the trap of like taking feedback personally. So the first question you can ask yourself is, what would I tell a friend of mine if they received this feedback? And you're going to notice that there's a big difference between what you tell yourself and what you tell a friend of yours. So a good example of this is you can think about breakups, right? So if someone breaks up with a friend of yours and they say, it's not you, it's me, what would you tell your friend? What do you think about them? And what do they tell themselves? What would you tell yourself? There's going to be a big difference there. Okay? Next question that we need to ask is, how did this feedback make me feel? Because oftentimes when we get feedback, we just think about the feedback. We think about changing it. We think about fixing it. We don't even think about the impact it had on us. And that's huge because ultimately the instrument that we are going to use to fix the situation is us. So if we become compromised in some way, it'll sabotage our attempts to fix the feedback. And this is why people get stuck getting the same damn feedback over and over and over again, right? People will tell you, you need to study harder. You need to apply yourself more. And once again, like, how do you do that? What is that? Who the fuck knows? The bigger problem, though, is you feel so bad after being told, oh, you would succeed if you just tried harder. The negative emotional impact to you tanks your motivation, and makes it impossible for you to try harder, because the whole point is your feelings decrease your motivation. And if your motivation is down, how are you supposed to try harder? So you have to understand how the feedback made you feel. Now, here's the next step. Okay, this is how we really start to fix it. And you can't really do this next step until you've done these others, which is what fears about myself become truer with this feedback. This is the biggest thing that most people miss about feedback. Is that when we get feedback, we each carry around some fears, right? I may not be capable. I'm an imposter. No one will ever love me. I don't have what it takes. And so when we get some feedback, we've got this fear. And the fear is sitting in the back of our mind. And it's waiting for evidence. Because you're terrified, right? So let's understand this from a neuroscientific perspective for a second. If I have a fear that is terrifying, what does the brain want to do? So we've evolved with our brains. If we're afraid of a snake, let's say we saw a snake an hour ago, what are we going to do to any stimulus in the environment around us that even remotely looks like a snake? It creates a cognitive filter that supports and reinforces the fear. And that's a survival mechanism, right? So if I saw a snake in my house an hour ago and there's a piece of rope on the ground, or there's an extension cord, my mind is going to jump to the possibility that that is the snake, and I'm going to freak out. So once we hold a particular fear, we have this cognitive bias that we will interpret information to support that fear. And this is why even constructive feedback, we can sort of make it personal and it sabotages us instead of being a roadmap to actually improve our lives. So you have to be aware of what fears about myself does this feedback confirm, and literally like write it out, right? It may sound scary to like put it on paper, but actually the whole reason that the fear grows so much is because we never face it. We never acknowledge it. It just lives in the back of our mind and continues to create cognitive filter after cognitive filter after cognitive filter. So it shapes our thought process without us ever realizing it because it's too scary to admit. So what you've got to do is ask yourself, what fears about myself become truer with this feedback? And now we're going to go to a evidence-based approach to sort of fixing this problem, okay? So the next thing that we need to ask ourselves is what factors outside of my control led to the feedback? And what factors in my control led to the feedback? Now, this is a really important step because if we look at it, what does our mind do automatically? It just looks at this. It completely ignores this part, right? So all we ever think about is what I did wrong. Oh my God, I'm such a terrible person. I'm not charismatic. That's why I'm not a team player. You know, and what we actually end up doing is if we think about, let's say we made a mistake, half of the mistake is ours to control. Half of the mistake is outside of our control, right? I know it sounds kind of weird, but how can you say that? Because no, it's all my fault. No, I mean, just think about that for a second. Any situation, especially at work, is not going to be 100% in your control. It's absolutely ridiculous. I suppose the only situation that I can kind of think of is if you're the only person who works at your job, you're your own boss and you control all of the market forces as well. That's, I suppose, a situation. But if you really think about it, anything at work, there's some work contribution, there's some non-work contribution. But the whole point is that our mind jumps to this. So we need to explicitly sort of think a little bit about what are the factors outside of our control. And so then, because normally what happens is until we acknowledge this, we feel responsible for this whole thing. We try to fix all of this. And then what happens is this is frustrating because half of this is impossible for us to fix, but we are accepting responsibility for fixing it anyway. And so this leads to inefficiency and frustration. okay? Because we're trying to fix things that are outside of our control, which means that of the stuff that we can control, we're at best putting forth 50% effort. So once you go through this and you start to realize, okay, there's actually some stuff that is outside of our control. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus 100% on this quadrant and actually on purpose draw a line over here and not worry about any of this stuff. And so this in turn will make us more efficient and less frustrated. Okay? So next thing that we're going to do, and we kind of talked about this a little bit already, is what actions can I take? And now we have to be a little bit careful here. So you have to separate this out into two further questions. What actions do I wish I could take? And what am I capable of reasonably? Okay? So this is huge. Because oftentimes when we think about responding to feedback, we just jump to everything. We're like, and we create this wish list that's based on this like idealized version of ourselves. If I was the person I knew I could be, I would wake up at 6 a.m. every day. I'd network in the evenings. I'd do this, I'd do that, I'd do this. No. Take a step back. Take a deep breath. What actions can you actually take? What's reasonable? For someone who has accomplished what you've accomplished over the last month, what is reasonable to do this week? Right? So we got to take a step back and not let our emotions turn our actions into a wish list. Because the more ashamed that we feel about ourselves, the more grandiose our actions are going to be. And thus we doom ourselves to failure because we're setting ourselves up for tasks that we won't be able to accomplish. Okay? Next question you've got to ask yourself is, how do I track improvement? So this is a really important question because when I talk to people who are upset about where they are in life, they'll say, I am such a loser. And then I'll say, okay, so you want to work on that? Great. How are you going to measure what percentage of progress you're making on being a loser? Like, how do you even measure that? And so we set goals for ourselves that are completely unmeasurable. And we don't want to be a loser anymore. I want to be a winner. Okay, cool. I get that you want that. That's a wish that you have, but how do you actually measure it? And then the next thing, and this is the last thing, which is oftentimes also very important, which people don't really acknowledge, especially when they're feeling ashamed about themselves and their ahamkar is active, is what is my contingency plan when things don't work? Okay? And related to this, who can I ask for help when things don't work? Because a lot of times when we get feedback, we don't even think about enrolling anyone else. We don't even acknowledge for a moment, I know it sounds kind of weird, but whose responsibility is it that you learn to do a good job at work? And so we all may say, oh, it's my responsibility. But the truth is that it's not just your responsibility, it's also your boss's responsibility, right? They're the ones that are responsible for you. And yet we have this culture nowadays where bosses don't accept responsibility of like the work product of people beneath them. And so it's kind of foreign, like it's actually partially their job. I contribute something and they contribute something. And when we receive feedback and we take it personally, the thought of asking for help never even crosses our mind. So let's say I set a target for myself 1 week from now, then and there, before I even get to that week, I should develop a contingency plan. Okay, who am I going to ask for help? Do I need to go see a therapist because I'm depressed? Do I need to get evaluated for a vitamin B deficiency? Do I need to spend some time with my friends, spend some time with family? Am I going to sign up for a course? Am I going to learn how to meditate? Am I going to start exercising? Can I ask coworkers for help? Can I ask my boss for help? And start to set your contingency plan in place. And so I know it sounds kind of weird, but What we actually want to do is like not take feedback personally. And if you're given personal feedback, even reject it. Because personal feedback is not actionable, is not measurable, is wholly within theoretically your control, even though there's nothing you can really do about it, right? If someone tells you, yeah, you're just not a good fit or you're not a team player, like what do you do about that? There's nothing you can do about it. And so as we sort of wallow in the shame of receiving personal feedback, as we accept that for personal feedback without approaching it critically, it worsens our sense of identity about ourselves, creates more of a cognitive filter, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because we're not actually making changes. We're just terrified that, oh my God, like I'm going to screw up, I'm going to screw up, I'm going to screw up. And then sort of creates this like reinforcing cycle. So oddly enough, what I'd encourage y'all to do is reject feedback that is personal in nature, because you can't do anything about that. And you don't have to reject it in a harsh way, right? Screw you. I don't accept that. But you can start to ask questions. Okay, what can I do about this? What actions would you recommend that I take? How are we going to measure progress? And even to start thinking a little bit about what amount of this feedback is outside of my control, what amount of this feedback is in my control, what actions can I take? And as you start focusing on an action-oriented approach, and there's research that shows that this is effective, it actually changes your attitude and mindset in the work-related space. Instead of wallowing in shame and frustration because you're such a loser, you start to actually make progress, right? And then you start to feel a little bit better about yourselves because actually your thoughts are focused on doing better. And then once you set up a measurement scheme for yourself and you actually start to hit those targets, that's going to actually boost self-esteem. And then you'll realize something that I know is really bizarre, but once we remove ego from the equation, feedback is one of the best things that we can get. Because feedback is the way for us to get better at life, get better at our job. And who doesn't want to be better? We all want to be better. Feedback actually moves us to one step closer to perfection, towards the ideal version of yourself. People are literally telling you what you're doing wrong so that you can fix it. And once you fix it, your life will be better. You will be better. Your performance will be better. But why are we so damn afraid of feedback? Because of the ego. So as long as ego is a part of it, it completely shifts the direction and impact of feedback. And as we stop taking it personally, as we stop accepting personal feedback and we start focusing on actions, just about everything will start to get better. Questions? Okay, so this is a good question. So what if something that you're getting feedback on is just not a strength of yours? You know that you suck at it and aren't interested in getting any better at it. So this is a prime example of the problem. Let's understand the statement. What the feedback that you're getting is not a strength of yours. That implies a static thing. There's no action there, right? There's no, like, if a strength or a weakness is not an action. It's an attribute of personhood. So first of all, that's part of the problem. That is actually taking the feedback personally. There is ego involved in that statement. And the second thing is you know that you suck at it and aren't interested in getting better at it. So let's think about what's the chicken and what's the egg. You say, I suck at it, therefore I'm not interested in getting better at it. Whereas I'd say it's actually flipped around. It is your belief that you can't improve at it because it's a character feature as opposed to an action that tanks your motivation. That's literally what we just talked about. If you believe you can't get better at it, that will tank your motivation. But instead, so what I would say is that if you feel like this is something I'm not good at, a couple of questions to ask yourself. How was I taught? Where does my perception that I'm not good at it come from? Because chances are, 99% chance, that your perception that you are not good at it comes from a comparison to another human being. And the unfair thing about that comparison is how were they taught and how were you taught? And this is what may be mind-blowing, is the idea that they were taught at all. There's a very good chance that they were actually taught. Someone sat them down and told them how to do this. And no one ever did that for you. So I think it's really a chicken or egg problem. where if you're not interested in getting better, that's what you need to understand. Why are you not interested in getting better? Probably because you don't think you can get better. And where did you come to the conclusion that you can't get better? Because you always took it personally instead of breaking it down into actions and measurable results. Great question, but really, really exemplifies the crux of the problem. So we've got a question, how can I give better feedback? So here's what I recommend about giving good feedback. Once again, you have to make it actionable and measurable. So you should think about, this is what we mean by constructive feedback. So telling someone that they're bad at something doesn't do you any good unless you can sort of provide it as reasoning if you're like changing their duties around, like that's one thing. But generally speaking, you want to make feedback actionable, right? And this is something that like can be very hard depending, because this can oftentimes require a lot of like resolution. But basically what you want to do is give people actionable feedback and measurable feedback. So what are the actions that they can take and how are we going to measure the progress? That's what you should really think about. So what do you want them to actually do and how are you going to measure whether it's successful or not? Does the ego always identify with the negatives? Not at all. So in this situation, the ego identifies with the negatives in the situation of negative emotion. So that's the presumption we're starting with. But ego can identify with all kinds of stuff. Good question. Okay, everyone's talking about how to deflate the ego. So we're going to actually have to pop on over to Ask a Coach, but we have a ton of stuff on ego, right? So this is both what I love and hate about streaming on Twitch. So what I love about it is that y'all get to ask questions. We get to interact with each other. What's unfortunate about streaming on Twitch is that we can never build on what we've done before, right? So how many streams have we done on ego? Dozens. We've had interviews about ego. We've taught about ego. So this is also why we have Dr. K's guide. And I think that the ADHD guide and doing stuff, the guide to ADHD and doing stuff, digs a lot into ego. So there's a lot of stuff that we've done around ego. And I'd say just like look at our resources. That's why they're there, right? That's why we upload things to YouTube. You can also check out our wiki. And we may have a community event at some point this year in 2023 around confidence and ego. But there's stuff in the meditation guide and there's stuff in the ADHD guide about ego. And it's packaged really well. Okay, so what we're going to actually do now is hop on over to Discord because we Ask a Coach is still going on. So I'm going to just pop on over real quick. Hold on a second. What if your entire viewer base is just one dude that can type really fast? My entire viewer base used to be one dude that could type really fast. And back when that person was my whole viewer base, I used to meet them in my office. And we would talk instead of type. And that's actually how we got started. The challenge is that our viewer, it would be easy if my viewer base was just one person. The whole challenge that we face is that the viewer base is more than one person. Like, that's what makes things hard, not easy. For some reason, I can't hear this. What's wrong? Okay. So let's pop on over.
Start to accept these emotions and feel them, but then I start to fake them of these said emotions, and I should know how I should feel things. So trying to break that down into three things, like, all right, okay, define what acceptance is, understand, like, what does it mean that there's a purpose to you faking these emotions, and then finally, why, or like, how did you get to the point of how a situation should make you feel? So giving you potentially three directions to be more specific and give more context behind that question. So really good question. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so we just popped in. So I think it sounds like people are talking a little bit about emotions and why they feel particular things and how to manage it. So if y'all are interested in more of that, go ahead and hop onto Discord. We're going to hang out there for a little bit, and otherwise we'll see y'all on Wednesday. So take care, everybody.